It's my pleasure to welcome you to the World Reconstruction Conference, the 5th edition of itself. We are delighted to join UNDP, World Bank, and the International Recovery Platform, including the government of Indonesia, to organize this conference on the margins of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. My name is Abhilash Panda. I head the work on infrastructure and resilience for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And as you would have heard in the previous panel session, most of the feedback, comments, and recommendations were all on the grounds of reconstruction, infrastructure, and recovery around it. Now, this parallel session would be going a bit into the details of that. We'll focus on the need for robust policies around the integration of resilience in infrastructure critical management, options for financing infrastructure resilience, and issues around infrastructure and service loss and damage data collection. Now, I won't be going into putting forward a speech or lengthy remarks for you because my previous panel members and the previous sessions have aptly done so. But I'm going to just quote some data from one of the very interesting reports out there, which says that infrastructure disruptions imposed costs between $391 billion and roughly $647 billion a year in low and middle income countries. And for that, building resilience is thus a precondition for developing sustainably in a changing climate. Now, financial losses from disasters are a systemic financial risk. They cascade through the financial system with capital flight from vulnerable sectors and communities, creating sovereign credit risk issues, defaults on debt, sudden and sharp write-downs from devaluation and insurance premiums. While we would have liked to touch down on all of these issues, my panelists today and the one both present physically and online, virtually with us, would at least try to answer some of these issues that most of the developing and developed economies are trying to address in the process of rebuilding and reconstruction. Now, I look forward to discussing on some of these topics with our distinguished panelists and how can we build more robust policies around the integration of resilience in critical infrastructure management, but also discuss some of the financing solutions around it. But before I do that, I would like to introduce my panelists who we have joining us virtually and also here on the stage with us. Today we have Professor Ranjit Disanaike, who is the Secretary of Infrastructure, State Ministry of Rural Roads and Other Infrastructure in Sri Lanka. He is also a Senior Professor in Civil Engineering at the University of Preparedness and the Chairman of Green Building Council of Sri Lanka. He is joining us online, and I'm hopeful he should be on the screen in a few more seconds. We'll also be hearing from Dr. Benjamin Trump. He's the adjunct professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. He's a governance scholar whose work focuses on decision-making and governance of significant uncertainty, such as emerging and enabling technologies, and developing organizational infrastructure, social and informational resilience against systemic threats to complex interconnected systems. Dr. Trump is part of Dr. Igor Linkov's team, who has been working with UNDRR and OECD on developing a resilient stress testing model for critical infrastructure. We will also have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Liz Verga from the University College London. Ms. Verga is the chair of Complex Systems in Civil Environment and Geomatics Engineering Department. She leads the Infrastructure Systems Institute and is the principal investigator for the coordination node of UK Collaboratorium for Research in Infrastructure and Cities. That's quite a mouthful in itself. Professor Verga will also be joining us online. I also have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Sean Tarbach. Sean is the Chief Executive of the International Cooperative and Mutual Insurance Federation. He joined ICMEF in 1995, and he has overseen the growth of the organization from 65 members in 1995 to 200 members in 70 countries. And lastly, my fellow panelists who are present with me in person. We have Mr. Ajay Makhija. He's the team leader, infrastructure resilience with the National Emergency Management Agency, New Zealand. The Infrastructure Resilience Team is responsible for strategic national emergency management planning framework and guidance for critical infrastructure stakeholders and support delivery of the Infrastructure Resilience Work Program with a strong focus on advocating for risk reduction. Ajay has previously worked in senior leadership roles in varied public and private sector organizations, including airports and hospitals. He has an MBA from University of Otago in New Zealand. And I also have Mr. Bijay Kumar, who's the Executive Director of Global Network of Civil Society Organizations for Disaster Risk Reduction. Bijay leads the Secretariat of GNDR and represents the Secretariat on the Global Board. He has a long track record in humanitarian development work, particularly in disaster risk reduction. He has hands-on experience in Africa, Europe, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, and is a strong advocate of shifting power from the international system to community-led capacities, preparedness, and response facilitated by local government. We all are Bijay. So thank you very much for joining us here, Ajay and Bijay, in person, and thank you to all my panelists who are online at different time zones. So very grateful for you to spend that time. Now, without going further into these official remarks and things around that, I'll join Bijay and Ajay here on the podium, and then we'll start the conversation with Ranjit and Ajay as the first of my panelists. Am I audible? Thank you. So maybe Ranjit, while you are online with us and bearing to listen, and Ajay, as you are both representing the governments and the public sector in itself, right? So could you, from your country perspective, share a bit on how can recovery strategies be used to strengthen resilience of key infrastructure sectors? What do you see as some of the gaps in recovery strategies, and how can they be improved? Maybe I'll start with Ranjit, as he's online, and then come to you, Ajay. Ranjit, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the kind introduction. That yeah, you may know that the presently countries in the big economic crisis right now. So there has been a lot of initiative has been taken by the government to improve the critical infrastructure. For examples, we have been building almost renewing almost all the road network as well as the highway network in this country. But because of the present economic crisis, we may have to slow down the improvement. And today, when you go to the critical infrastructure, now we are in the shortage of fuel, gas, and other essential community. It has become a more critical factor, so that we are planning to improve the capacity of these areas. So that has been thinking right now by the government, because of otherwise we may have to all the time wait until the next shipment come to the Sri Lanka. Therefore, in the long run, rather than waiting for the shipment coming to Sri Lanka, most important items which we import, government is thinking to improve the storage capacity so that we don't have to worry about the delay in shipment coming, as well as some situation necessary good has come to the port due to the bad weather, it delay by few days to distribute. So that again become a crisis situation in the country. So this is where right now we are.
Thanks, Ranjit. It's definitely a challenging time for Sri Lanka,
Yes, yes.
and I can understand some of the issues that you're seeing and facing in itself. But while we're living through it, so we'll maybe see the recovery process gradually coming in place. So maybe I'll move to you, Ajay, here on the same question, and just get your perspective from how's it with New Zealand and itself.
Thank you. Just testing. Yeah, kia ora, everyone. Hello. and thanks for the opportunity. As we know, recovery actually starts way before we respond to any event or disaster really happens. And it's also important to highlight that recovery is not a one-time event or a process. It's a sort of a cyclic process, similar to a continuous improvement cycle. And any effort to improve resilience of infrastructure has direct impact on recovery times, restoration periods, and ultimately reduced impact on our communities. And I think community focus is important for infrastructure to give context. Improving recovery strategies or developing those, I think the key, I want to make three key statements around that. One is we need to really look at developing and establishing recovery standards that includes levels of service post-disaster, restoration periods, and the performance of our infrastructure. And this needs to be done in conjunction with our communities, so they have a say in terms of what kind of expected levels of service they desire or deserve post-disasters. And that should translate into mitigation and reduction strategies pre-event. The other aspect of this sort of process is that community resilience also improves because they can prepare based on realistic expectations post-disaster of the service available to them. The second point I want to make is having established processes and structures that pulls together researchers, infrastructure providers, government, insurance, as well as communities who post-disaster really have key consideration for resilience as part of the rebuild phase. And this would look at reducing future risks from the hazard. And lastly, I want to say this process also need to have inbuilt assessments to measure the performance post-disaster. So then you can, as I was talking, it's a continuous cycle, go back and rethink and reestablish those standards and build mitigation based on those new standards in place. In terms of some of the gaps and challenges, financing is one. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And the eternal question of who pays. We also don't have end-to-end hazard to impact to recovery infrastructure research. And this leads to lack of data-driven planning. And also resilience is not a siloed system. Because of the interdependent nature of critical infrastructure, we don't have really good cross-cutting investment prioritization built into our system. And lastly, in terms of the challenges, community participation and translating impacts on community into resilience standards is viewed as difficult, time-consuming, and onerous. And lastly, in terms of some of the ways to improve is, obviously, we got the legislation, regulatory tools that we can use, but it's more about collaborative planning amongst all the stakeholders. We've all heard the word build back better, but the word foundation of engineering organization states build back differently is a better way to look at it. Back to you.
Thanks, Ajay, for that, and also to Ranjit. Interesting remarks. And you touched upon also all the financing issue, but also who pays for it. And I think that's one essential and critical question that we all need to try to find an answer to. Is it the end user? Is it the investor? Is it the public authorities in the middle of trying to put everything in place? But maybe we'll come back to that and try to answer some of these issues. Now, I'll move to Sean here. And Sean, if you heard Ajay, he did mention about the role of the insurance market in itself, right? The insurance sector that could play a role in addressing some of this issue. But you also heard about the other barriers and opportunities. So Sean, as you represent the insurance industry, the ICMIF with more than 200 members in itself, what are some of the options for financing infrastructure resilience through the infrastructure recovery process? Would you have any examples or any suggestions to make?
Yeah, thank you, Abhilash. By the way, I think your socks are very good. Very loud as well. That is excellent. Thank you. I've got Graham Clark, who's one of my colleagues, one of our members in the room there, so he might be able to answer some things as well. But just coming to your question about the financing side, well, the insurance industry has two areas in which it focuses on. One is the asset side, and the other is the risk side. So I think we can talk more about the risk and the underwriting maybe later, but you asked me particularly about the investment piece. And what we've seen, we've been doing a survey now of our members for the last 3 years, and what we've actually seen is a huge increase in the amount invested in sustainable investments over the last 3 years. In fact, year on year, it's doubling pretty much. So we're currently sitting out of a total of $2 trillion in investable assets from members. We're sitting with nearly 600 billion invested in sustainable investments, so over 25%, which is quite outstanding actually. But when you break some of that down, there is a particular area around the wider part of the green bonds, and as you've seen on my bio there, that I sit on the Climate Bond Initiative board, which is the one that monitors and does the taxonomy around green bonds. So currently on the green bond side, there is $3 trillion in investments at the moment, but that again is ratcheting up. So last year alone, 2021, they had $1.1 trillion of issuance, and that again is almost 50% up on the previous year. So, and this is going across all of the world now. So countries, about 60 different countries have that. Have issued green bonds, and mostly around energy, buildings and transport. So I would say a lot of that is infrastructure. Now, is that doing the infrastructure post-recovery? That's a different question. But at least the investments are there, and most of the green bonds are oversubscribed. So there is a huge demand for green bonds at the moment. Most of the purchases are from the private sector, I think over 60%. So that is the insurers, the asset managers and the banks, the pension funds, they're the ones that tend to be buying these. But if I can give you some examples of the green bond side of things, so Fogson is one of our members. They have over $3 billion in green bonds. Remember, there's only 12 billion that our members have purchased at the moment. But they've got quite an innovative way of looking at things. They will actually look to see what investments are needed either in their country, or in this case also outside of their country. That's Sweden is where they're based. So they've made one bond investment to make communities more resilient in a small area within Sweden. That investment would not have been made by the local authorities unless Foxconn had decided to issue a green bond in order to make their people, in order to make their people more resilient. What they've also invested in is a green bond issued by the European Investment Bank to invest in two areas, one in Indonesia and one in Africa, both of those for infrastructure rebuilds and for energy, green energy and energy efficiency. So I think what I can say is that these investments are coming. Another one of our members, the cooperators, who's leading in this way from Canada, they've taken a slightly different view. They're actually assessing where the resilience needs are within their country, and then going to the governments or the local authorities and saying, this is a need, you're not pursuing, you're not actually doing anything in terms of investing in that need. We've got the assets, we'd like to invest in there, but what we really need now is to measure the impact. And I think if we're being brutally honest with ourselves, governments, local authorities do not look to see what the impact is of these investments. So the money comes in, but they still go for the cheapest option in terms of the rebuild. They don't go for the sustainable option. And I've seen that in the UK many times in the past. They're still not buying into sustainable long-term infrastructure rebuilds, and that's what needs to happen. And I think if the insurance industry, certainly the mutual and cooperative industry, are starting to derive that it can't be in isolation anymore. It can't just be the way it's always been, i.e. we buy something and then and then the government invests in it, but ultimately it's a short-term decision, not a long-term decision. And I think that's the change we're starting to see. So I know there's been problems in the past, but if I can give the audience any comfort, there is a lot of change coming, and it's happening much quicker than even I expected. It's almost doubling every year. So I do think the money is starting to come through, because at the end of the day, if insurers can make their communities safer, then ultimately their claims will come down. So it just makes business sense to do this. But business sense hasn't prevailed in the past in the whole of the insurance industry. But I think with the mutuals and cooperatives, we can look at this long term and take a long term view on where we invest our assets in order to make our communities safer. So I hope that gives you a quick summary of the investment side, Abhilash, and over to you.
Thanks. Thank you a lot, Sean. Very pragmatic and very interesting solutions that you're proposing. I will come back to you on two things, but after I go through with my other panelists. One would be on the example you mentioned about Canada, on the corporators, and maybe also on the taxonomy and the green bonds or the climate bonds. But I'll give you a bit of time to think about it while I take the talk to other panelists. So Bijay, just coming back to you here, I think Ranjit and Ajay both mentioned about the role of the community and the role of community in the design of infrastructure recovery, or the role that community has to play, or the engagement when that needs to be done, right? Now, you lead the global network of civil society organizations for disaster reduction. Can you share a bit about the challenges that civil society organizations have faced, or the community largely had faced, for or within the infrastructure recovery dimension? Now, with that, if you could also talk a bit about what are some of the ways we can strengthen that engagement, that would be also helpful.
Thanks, Abhilash. And it's great to see the panel. Good afternoon, everybody. It is nice to see all of you here. Just actually to introduce myself, thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. Abhilash actually introduced me as heading the network, the global network of civil society organization. We are a network of 1,450 organizations from across 127 countries. We are working to reduce the disaster by pursuing risk-informed development, and also we talk of localization. The fundamental question on the infrastructure is, I'll touch upon a few areas, and then actually try to see how can we address some of the issues that actually puts forward. In our understanding, infrastructure is an integral part of the ecosystem and culture. That all of us, we know that. Now, we should treat the infrastructure as an integral part, and if we treat that, it will be important for us to understand that how the infrastructure is linked to various processes in the society. And there is a systemic nature that needs to be taken on board when we are actually talking of analyzing the infrastructure use. So the systemic nature is linked to the culture, society, the ecosystems, the power analysis, the power bit, the control, the access, all these factors are critically linked there as well. And when we are talking of a resilient infrastructure, then it has to be resilient to multi-hazard scenarios. So multi-hazards means that it should be resilient to flood, it should be resilient to drought, it should be resilient to earthquake, or various other hazards that we are actually talking of. And that can best be done if we adopt a nature-based solutions. So when we are, let's say for example, if we are talking of generating energy, instead of going for heavyweight coal mines or coal mining or coal-based or fossil fuel-based infrastructure, perhaps there can be alternate ways of looking at wind energy, looking at the green energy, which is currently the major focus. So that might actually help to sustain the resilient livelihood. And it is also essential, as actually stated in the Sendai framework, that we have to adapt an all society approach. It cannot be in the hands of one group of people. It cannot be in the hands of the private sector for building the infrastructure. It cannot be in the hands of only government or only event systems. It has to be an all society where, as Avilas is saying, that where the community is involved in designing the basic part of the infrastructure. So that design, when the community is actually designing it, as I saw it in many of the post-disaster responses in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, in Indonesia after the tsunami, that's quite a bit of design was actually done by the community's knowledge. And then they might not have the technical knowledge, but that technical knowledge can be combined with the community's knowledge to make it even more effective and sustainable. Now, it is also important to actually look at the cost-benefit analysis, that we do that from an economic perspective, but perhaps it is essential to see it, how we can see it from a political and social perspective. And this is best delivered by adopting a localization approach, where we actually create a mechanism that actually takes into account a local perspectives. If it is a river basin you are talking of, it might be a multinational or go beyond the national borders, but that river basin itself can be one community or one unit of analysis and also building that infrastructure. Now, one of the critical things that is being talked of is financing. In my understanding, that is the most important question that we have today. Is there additional money that somebody is giving? Who is giving that money, and how that money comes? That is the basic question that all of us, we are struggling to have an answer for. Now we understand this. My view is that actually perhaps there is a need to actually see how we reallocate and do our development programming, disaster risk reduction programming, the recovery programming better, which is much more sustainable and is actually is resilient. So that is one way of doing things. That way we can save this. But at the same time, we should also look at that how the investment can be actually be brought from the private sector, from the governments who have the money, and also the national governments. So where appropriate structures can be created, finance mechanism can be created, which can be actually delivered. And one of the things that is being talked about is CDRI as well. So like, so perhaps it is useful to see how we can design the multi-sector and multi-institutional mechanism as a trust fund or a finance facility which can be created or which is created. And last but not the least, that when we are talking of this, we need to have a coherent approach, and that should be linked to Sustainable Development Goal 9. So we need to actually see how our resilient infrastructure is built and is linked across the various global frameworks. Thanks a lot, Avilas. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Vijay, for that. Very inspiring. Coherence, cost-benefit analysis, environment, nature-based solutions, multi-hazard, all of society, and absolutely the financing issue. Now, some of the things that you have touched upon are definitely critical in addressing building back better, right? Or, as Ajay said, building sustainably. I may have missed the suggestion that the World Engineering Federation of Organization had, but we'll also come to that. But just speaking of some of the things that Vijay, you were saying, I'll invite now Professor Varga, and following that, Dr. Trump. Now, Liz, you heard the remarks from Ajay, Ranjit, and Sean, and then also from Vijay now. You are also involved in designing what's called the principles of infrastructure resilience. And Ben, you are also involved in the design of the stress testing model. Now, can you tell us a bit more about both the principles and then the stress test, one of the other? Is some of these things that's being discussed here are they getting addressed in the global conversations around the principles, or could the stress test be some of some way to address, let's say, what Ranjit was talking about, the crisis in Sri Lanka and the recovery from there? Can it be of a potential use in any of those discussions and building essentially in a more sustainable manner? So Liz, I'll pass the floor first to you, and then Ben will come to you after Liz.
Okay, thank you very much, Abhilash, and everyone at the conference. Can I first thank UNDRR for their initiative on raising the global importance of resilient infrastructure. To be clear, critical infrastructure provides essential services, excuse me, including potable water, the removal of waste and sewage, energy and heat supply, telecommunication channels, and options for mobility, whether they are for private roads or for public, such as rail or sea transport. Now, these essential services provide the social and economic activity enablers for hospitals and businesses to operate. The principles for resilient infrastructure give us a set of goals and key actions for nations to know what needs to be done to deliver resilience. There are 6 principles and 33 key actions. They cover the whole of infrastructure life cycle, from strategy through to design, build, operate, and end of life. The principles also consider all phases of resilience, not just recovery. So the other 3 phases are prevention and resisting disruptions, absorption, which is about continuing to deliver critical services, and transformation to implement change. Our focus today is on recovery, which is generally about bouncing back. So I will highlight the key points in the principles for resilient infrastructure on this. First, I want to mention net resilience gain. So this is a commitment to prevent systemic resilience getting worse, and it is getting worse all the time. And also to make systemic resilience better by avoiding making changes and investments that don't improve systemic resilience. Systemic resilience is about taking into account consideration of all components of infrastructure and making sure that together they provide the resources to keep the lights on, the water flowing, and so on. This commitment helps recovery by reducing the impact of failure and by being prepared with appropriate resources to implement recovery in the appropriate way. It also points out that recovery must not always put back infrastructure to how it was before. We can't just bounce back. Okay, so next I want to mention the need to build resilient infrastructure for recovery. We need to know what it means to have resilient infrastructure. We need to understand how the absence or presence of critical infrastructure makes it difficult or easy to recover. And we need alternative and contingent recovery strategies. Third, we need to build these recovery strategies so they are fit for purpose. We need to understand the risks and uncertainties, which means the importance of stress testing, scenario analysis, vulnerability and exposure analysis to the various hazards in the locations of the infrastructure. We need to explore different recovery strategies to know what works best, regardless of the hazards, regardless of the vulnerabilities, and regardless of whether or not critical components have been disrupted. Recovery should strengthen the system that has failed so it is protected from future failures. We need to also assure that emergency recovery funds enable the implementation of best recovery strategies. I have 2 small points. Fourth is that policy instruments must integrate across sectors and must finance resilient infrastructures. We need to make sure that local authorities and national governments seek to strengthen the ability of infrastructure to recover quickly and appropriately, we need to set aside funds based on evidence. We must also work with private investment to de-risk these recovery strategies. Finally, we must work to improve data collection so that we have a good basis as evidence for decision making. This is about collecting data from different sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much for putting forward some of the highlights of the principles. Now, Ben, I'll pass the floor to you. If you could share a bit about what is the stress testing and how does it work in a post-disaster recovery scenario? Is it actually going to make a difference in the current approaches? And following you, I'll also go back to Ranjit because we understand Sri Lanka is now exploring the feasibility of stress testing. So, Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning from Boston, where it is a sunny 4 in the morning. So with that, to get right into stress testing, when we look at the field of resilience right now, it has emerged and developed substantially over the past decade. We are starting to see many tools come into focus about how do we parameterize and benchmark what resilience is and what does it mean from a variety of contexts. But stress testing remains elusive. So at its heart, what a stress test is we look at the configuration of a system and we ask ourselves, what would it take to cause that system to collapse? Or if not collapse, degrade enough that those who rely upon that system, be it an infrastructure system, a financial system, or even the human body, from an individual up to a supranational level, if their lives are infringed, what would it take? What would it require to reach that endpoint? And then ultimately, what might we do to recover from and adapt to lost functions and through disruption? So unfortunately, from a stress testing perspective, while resilience has evolved quite a bit over the past 10 to 15 years as a academic discipline, as well as a community of practice, stress testing for infrastructure is really in its nascency. And in order to drive things forward with this field of stress testing, we've had to borrow very heavily from concepts both from the medical sector as well as the financial sector, as well as gold standard practice with risk assessment, which is the TATRAD of threat, vulnerability, and consequence-based assessments, as well as resilience that many of the other panelists have noted. Which looks at the ability of a complex system to plan and prepare for, absorb, recover from, and adapt to adverse events. So within that stress test, what we're looking to do is not become too scenario dependent. What we don't want to do is take an individual system and overfit it to a specific set of circumstances. Although these type of live exercises can be important to evaluate how our infrastructure system, be it a bridge, a dam, a levee, complex communications or transport infrastructure, et cetera, may perform under various circumstances. But instead, we want to get an inside look about how the system is formed. What are its dependencies? What are its inputs and outputs? How do communities use and enjoy or disuse that piece of infrastructure under various circumstances? And for us, and in collaboration with Abhilash and Alex and Gianluca, we've recently published a correspondence paper in the journal Nature that initially describes what we're going for, which is a 3-tiered approach towards evaluating the stress test of a system. Again, hopefully it should be situationally situation and threat agnostic. So within our 3 tiers, our first tier is looking at more of a qualitative benchmark. This is a characterization study. Within this, primarily what we're trying to understand is less about how the system performs against live conditions, live data, economic user support, et cetera, and more about what are the core dependencies of the system, what are its input and output drivers, and how can we begin to understand it at a qualitative or at a semi-quantitative level. Now, within these types of assessments, they often are going to lack in quantitative rigor, but they do give you a first foray into drawing a visual map about how what your system looks like. Now, once you get into tier 2, that's when we start getting into first a bit more math, but secondly, we're able to start understanding the interaction effects between systems. My other panelists mentioned that we can no longer rely on silos, and we need to understand the impact that different systems have when they influence one another. So tracking the interaction effect or the potential for cascading failure. If one component of a system is disrupted, how does that percolate into others? For example, for the Port of Los Angeles, which has experienced tremendous backlogs and shipping, like with many hundreds of container ships waiting to gain entry to the port for several years for a large queuing system, not individual ships, of course. What we found is individual components of that Port of LA were causing rather substantial disruption downstream, such as the inability of truck drivers rather than the actual longshoremen to offshore container ships. So solving one component would prevent a cascading failure downstream. The third and final tier is more quantitative, where we're looking at, from a network science perspective, how these individual systems connect to one another, as well as how shifts in information and data influence system design and recovery in real time. So within this stress testing approach, just to wrap up, because I know I'm out of time, the three components of this stress test approach, you don't necessarily have to perform all three. They are dependent upon the type of the labor and time and money that you have to dedicate into performing them. Maybe just understanding a basic characterization of your system is enough to be able to see, well, I really have some glaring holes I need to fix in order to backstop my infrastructure system. The further you progress, the more granularity that you get, but also the more difficult and labor intensive it becomes. And we do believe this can be very effective in real-time support because we, particularly in tier 2 and tier 3, you can see, one, the interaction effects between these systems, and two, how these systems degrade and fail over time, possibly in a systemic manner, as well as where to be injecting much needed funding or changes into your system in a way that can promote more expeditious recovery. And so with that, I'll yield the floor. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that. Tiered model approach. What I think the end goal, if I understood correctly, is to help identify priority investment sectors for decision making, right? We'll come back because I think there's some pertinent questions around and on how does this in reality operate. But I think Ranjit may be able to give us a sort of an example, because we understand Sri Lanka is now looking into stress testing its infrastructure systems. Now, Ranjit, I'm passing the floor to you here. So if you could give us a bit more on how is this being put into practice, and what are you expecting out of a stress test process, given the current economic crisis and what's going to come in the days in the near future?
Thank you again, Abhilash. To look at the present crisis in Sri Lanka, it has been the main. There is always trade balance in Sri Lanka. So, but it did not pass to the common man directly. All the government has tried to keep this trade balance and try to cover this. Because of this COVID, there has been a lot of activities that did not bring us the dollar into the country, especially tourism and some other manufacturing which we are going on in the country. That brought widened this gap of the trade deficit, the balance. That is the reason why we suddenly see the current crisis in the country, lack of essential things which are mainly import from other countries, fuel, gas, and some other items. So that really good opportunity, good stress for the country as well as the people to think beyond our boundaries. So we need to have the critical infrastructure recovery for the kind of renewable energy, because we have a lot of solar and of course the hydro. You have to prioritize these kind of areas and try to recover the energy requirement within the island itself. It is a kind of mandate for the present government, go for the 80% of the renewable energy. Another area where we have neglected the manufacturing. So there has been some of the items which we could have manufactured, but because of the open economy, people would like to bring them, and it is a buying and selling business. You can make the profit very quickly. But we realize when it comes to the situation like today, some people, they have a local money, there is a requirement, but they cannot bring the goods from the other countries because of the lack of dollar. So that really good opportunity for the government of Sri Lanka as well as the people think beyond out of the box. So this crisis what we have today, I believe it will be a good opportunity for the as a nation to recover sustainable development. So that is, we have to improve infrastructure for the mainly renewable energy and manufacturing wherever possible, then improve the quality and try to grab the foreign market, whereby we are struggling between the lack of foreign currency in order to buy the things. So for our all the infrastructure, which should be developed, where we cater for the current crisis rather than just sake of pleasing the people. We have to go out of the present system of pleasing the people to a more toward the sustainable development. So that is the what I believe important is the present crisis. I've been a person who believe on the sustainable development. I believe what the stress level that we have in the government and the people will, rather than think in a crisis, it could have changed to a challenge, blessing, think back our mistake that we have done so far and correct ourselves, go for the sustainable development, understanding where we are critical, right? So that that is a good opportunity for us. Over to you.
Thanks, Ranjit, for that. Very well put of the import-based economy and, the need for transition and building different type of infrastructure and putting different type of infrastructure in place. We believe the stress testing does not need to be limited to infrastructure. It could also go all the way to stress testing the physical systems, or stress testing the banking or the reserve system in itself. But that's more for you and the government to decide. And indeed, every crisis brings an opportunity to build it differently and build it more sustainably. But I would like to connect that what you mentioned to Ben on what he was saying about the purpose of stress testing and how does it help in a recovery environment. But just in a while, because I wanted to go back to Bijay here. maybe this time sitting from your chair, Vijay, so that becomes easier for you to respond. Sorry, Ajay, can you help me pass it to him? So Vijay, you gave some of the initial thoughts around what needs to be done, right? You know, what are some of the segments or aspects we need to look at, elements when it comes to recovery of infrastructure sector. But what role could the civil society play in that? Or largely, how could the civil society help in addressing some of these issues? Because we have to realize a lot of the infrastructure assets are either publicly owned or privately being put in place. And definitely it needs the community engagement. But how do we foster that? How do we strengthen that engagement?
Listening to the panel members, and I just actually, I thought, what are the critical couple of things that we need to keep in mind? One, from whose perspective the infrastructures are built or rebuilt or recovered. So that's a fundamental thing. If it is from the perspective of the people, from the perspective of the communities, our first question is, are they involved in designing it? Are they involved in, have they been consulted? That's the first thing. Second thing, are we putting a system? We should ask this question. I'm asking this question being in Africa for half of my life and also working in Sri Lanka, Afghanistan and all these places as well. Are we putting the system which is accountable, transparent? Or the system itself is leaking? So that actually that creates a trouble in terms of the quality of the infrastructure delivered, the amount of the money involved, and that is what the critical question that actually is also need to be thought through. And number three, when you are talking of designing an infrastructure, as I said earlier, it is quite closely linked to a systemic analysis. Have we done an analysis? What is the implication of our trade deficit? Have we done an analysis how it is impacting the fiscal policy? That is what exactly, just to give, Ranjit, just to give an example of Sri Lanka, that is a typical question. I would actually, in retrospect, I will ask, did we ask these questions? When we were actually designing, say, in Hambantota port, did we ask this question? So like say, I'm not actually, I'm not actually perhaps raising as a political question, but I'm raising it as a lesson to be learned, the way we design it. Now, all the three things that I said, I do see a critical role of an alternate group in the society, and that is the civil society, which can bring the perspective of all those people who are involved. It can bring the perspective of the communities and also create a mechanism where the community's perspective is brought in by bringing the perspectives of all stakeholders, that include private sector, that include academia, that include civil society organization, faith-based organization, and also the local government. Now, if that mechanism creates, that's what we saw when we actually did views from the front line in 50 countries that we did. We tried to bring the perspective of the communities where we could see the way the community is analyzing the various risks and how they will actually categorize and how they will come up with the solutions. Now, obviously, they don't have all the solutions themselves. So they will be consulting and interacting with the academia. They will be interacting with the private sector. They will be interacting with the local governing institutions. So that role can be played by civil society organizations. And the second thing, in addition to this convening role of all society approach, the critical role some of the civil society and many of the civil society organizations can play is promoting an accountability to the communities that it serves, that it intends to serve. So that mechanism from a rights perspective can be created in the state and created in the countries which can actually make the various institutions accountable. So that is the second thing that civil society can play that critical role. And third thing, which is the most critical role, is creating a mechanism where countries can learn from each other. So let's say where you actually create a mechanism where there's a knowledge hub, or there is something that we saw in India, for example, in Odisha, the infrastructure that was built post 99 cyclone, that could be actually replicated in other places. So some of the infrastructure which was built in Sri Lanka, that could be actually replicated in Indonesia and vice versa. So like say, so we can actually learn from the various parts of the world, and that is what the other thing which might actually work in the advantage of creating. So it is a, what I would actually say, it is not a politics of confrontation. It is not a confrontation that I am proposing. It is a politics of proposition. So that proposition which can actually analyze the various gaps and actually create that opportunity where we can learn from the success where government is involved. A typical example, Indonesia, we can learn so much from Indonesia, the way they generated the resilient infrastructure, which is which they call it as pentahelix, which involves media, academic institutions, civil society organizations, local government, and that is how perhaps the way that it can be replicated. So that is the other role that civil society can play.
Thanks, Vijay. Very helpful. And I think there's a lot of messages in that to take away. There was another question or another element that was raised in the outset, was the role of financing, right? You know, the issue of financing recovery of infrastructure. Now, Sean, you mentioned in the initial opening remarks about the volume of investments coming through the bonds market, through the bonds instrument in itself. But you also mentioned a bit about what's the example that's taking place in Canada, where there is some work around investing in resilience in itself. Any headways around? Could you give us a bit more around the example of Canada, or maybe also the other question I had for you is, how do you see the integration of resilience in the bond instruments, the climate bond instruments or the green bonds instruments in itself, or they are predominantly geared towards mitigation aspects of it, or does it take resilience as a parameter for investment, as a criteria of investment?
Thank you, Abhilash. No, it doesn't at the moment, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And as I said earlier, I do think it's important that the green bonds have an impact measurement, and whether that's the SDGs or whether that's resiliency, I think that needs to happen, and we're in discussions with the Sean Kidney and his team at the Climate Bond Initiative to try and build or bake that into any issuance of green bonds. But I do think we need to come back to how we work together. So again, coming to SDG 17 and partnerships, I think the change we've seen is that governments and the industry need to work closer together. And governments, I mean, in a broader sense. And I'll give you a wonderful case example, which involved my chair, or incoming chair, Rob Wesling, and your boss, Mamie Mezzatori, who both spoke at a conference in Canada last month. And Rob Wesling runs the Corporators, which is about third biggest insurer in Canada. But he was having no luck getting through to the government, the Canadian government, to actually talk about resilient investments and making people safer. And yet, when Mamie came along, they didn't realise that she was in the speaker panel. But as soon as they did, the Canadian government did a total flip and said, "Well, who's invited her? And this is brilliant." And then from there, the doors started to open. So I do think we are playing this role together as ICMIF and UNDRR. I do think people need to think differently. They can't carry on doing the things the way they've always been done through the different silos that they all have. And I think this change has got to happen much quicker. So another example I talked from the underwriting, more of the underwriting side, is the report that we did, Abhilash, and you were very much involved in, is the move from protection to prevention. And we issued this time last year. It's full of case studies of how insurers have embedded prevention or making communities more resilient. We've come up with 7 mechanisms between us, which go into how we use pricing for incentives for risk reduction, how we have prerequisites and exemptions, how we ensure investment reduces and prevents risk, and builds resilience. We've got the risk awareness through the education side. How do we build and share capacity and technology for risk modeling, analysis and monitoring? How do we promote and enhance local social capital for responding to disasters? And lastly, how do we collaborate with the public sector? And I think this piece of work has been fantastic for us. We're, as you know, working through a benchmark now as to how to self-test all of these 7 mechanisms. We hope to launch that in October to our members at our 100-year conference in Rome. That, I think, will be a benchmark that many of the mutual sector will get behind, and hopefully we can then scale this to being part of the global insurance sector as well, because that is what is needed. And I think if we can start to do these things and focus on prevention as part of our business strategy, that'll be very important. The other side I'd like to mention is the Sustainable Development Goals. It was mentioned earlier, number 9 is about infrastructure. So we're building, again, another benchmark. It's called the SDG Mutual Calculator with Swiss Re, which is the biggest reinsurer in the world, and has the sanction of the UNEP as well behind it. So there are 4 areas we're looking at there to measure. One is around the total insured value of sustainable infrastructure. So that's, are we focusing on that? The second is on the insurance to support sustainable tourism, trade and transport. So that's more practical down to the levels of what needs to be done. Thirdly is the insurance supporting and upgrading and retrofitting of sustainable infrastructure. Again, are we providing insurance and are we encouraging them to do things and measure the impact of what they're doing in the insurance side? And then lastly is it's insurance support for innovative technologies to support sustainable infrastructure. And there I can talk a little bit about, say, carbon neutral steel or green steel as it's being called. And one of our past chairs actually invested personally, as well as many others, into a new steel production which doesn't use fossil fuels. It's called hybrid, so hydrogen breakthrough iron making technology. And that's produced its first green steel in 2021. So I think this is starting to come, and it does sound a bit random that insurance is involved in this, but we're actually involved in all industries because we insure all industries. And if we can drive better practices through the insurance mechanism and also encouragement of sustainable practices by the pricing or by exclusion, then we can start to drive the industry as well. And I think that's quite important in terms of the underwriting side. So we've got the assets on the underwriting side, and I think between us, if we play both those cards well and drive the change that is needed and do things in partnership rather than in silos, then we will see that change happening much quicker. But it isn't easy, as you know, Abhilash. There are plenty of people in the world that are resistant to change. But I think we have to push and keep pushing on these. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, for that. Definitely, there is more required on coordination in trying to answer some of these big issues out there. We don't have much time. We roughly have 9 minutes left, but I want to see if there are any questions from the floor. If not, I do have my own. But before that, Ajay, I wanted to come back to you on after hearing some of our panelists and their opinions. Now, again, from where you sit in the government of New Zealand, we are talking a lot based on hindsight, right? Past disasters, past events, and the recoveries in that and learnings from it. But there is the entire issue around the future events that's going to come in, right? There's a lot of variability around it, uncertainty, let's say. So how do you see the recovery or the design of infrastructure investments or the recovery of infrastructure is currently that's being planned to put in place and manage to address some of the events that are going to happen in the future that we have not yet seen to come?
Yeah, that's a challenging question because the infrastructure, as I mentioned, we don't have a really coordinated approach in terms of infrastructure investment, given the interdependency of infrastructure in there. But we do have some legislative tools and regulatory tools that we can use. We're going through currently emergency management legislation reform, and we're trying to see if we can strengthen some of the areas which we have control over, that we can strengthen and ensure the infrastructure entities and organizations have roles and responsibility around building resilience and recovery efforts. For example, as I mentioned about developing service level standards is requiring them to have them available, publicly available, enforcing legislation so they have response and recovery plans based on known hazards and risks in the organization or at national, regional, or local level. And at a BAU level, we require them to have regular assessment of the vulnerability of infrastructure to the known hazards, and also regular assessment of its vulnerability to new information as it comes in. And research is ongoing, so we know we have really some credible major disasters that we know are on the horizon. It's ensuring that we have proper planning and arrangements in place and the structures in place, that we are doing our best possible through regulatory tools, as I just mentioned, but also close collaboration with all the stakeholders that we need to get involved in to put some mitigation in place to reduce the risk from those hazards on the horizon.
Thank you very much, Ajay. Very helpful for that. We still have a bit of time. If there's anybody has any questions from the floor, there is a mic roving around, so do raise your hand if anybody has a question. I can only see until here and not further that side. But while colleagues are thinking of anything that they may want to ask or raise, I do have a question for you, Ben, which I did mention earlier. You heard Ranjit mention about the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, and the dependency on import and the market in itself, and so on and so forth. Now, is there anything that you could put forward as an example from the stress testing environment or the model that could potentially help? It does not need to be specific to case of Sri Lanka. It could be specific in any other environment that's just undergoing a crisis, that would help identify the government or the decision maker in prioritizing investment.
Absolutely. So the shortest answer I could give you is the primary goal of a stress test is when we're looking to see how different components of our system are connected to one another and interdependent upon one another, we're looking for single points of failure. So these are conditions where a little bit of stress upon a targeted system or targeted set of resources causes the greatest amount of destruction and devastation upon the broader system and network. So what a stress test would be looking to do from a case of infrastructure is look to see if we start to see declines in tourist dollars, we start to see declines in certain commodity products. If we start to see maybe not declines in commodity product prices, but a reduction in our ability to harvest, package, and export those. How would all of these factors put together influence the overall health of our given infrastructure system, our ability to finance it, our ability to pay employees to operate it, our ability to supply it with critical resources like water, like energy, and others. And within this, we're looking to see, is there any individual component? And it could be something like a staple crop, or a small but dedicated portion of our workforce that performs a specific skill. That would cause, if that subcomponent is disrupted, causes the greatest overall harm, that does one of two things. It either causes a substantial loss in function, like devastating consequences, or from the recovery end, requires much more time or labor to recover from and adapt to long term. So what stress testing hopefully tries to do is understand where those single points of failure are located, as well as what interventions might be made to either better enable that potential single points of failure to absorb risk, or more robustly recover lost function if it is disrupted to a significant degree.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for that. There's a gentleman on my left and extreme right of the room. Could somebody help me with the mic there, please? Could you please state your name and the institution? Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Chair. My name is Tam. I'm a Sustainable Urbanization Specialist with the United Nations Human Settlements Program. Actually, my question is also to yourself, Benjamin, and it's really interesting to hear a little bit about how the impacts of the supply chain have affect the stress testing work that you're doing. I'm just curious. I think we've seen in a lot of our work where the stress testing benefits from community engagement, particularly where the incidents are in rural and isolated areas, and you don't have the expertise that can go in, so the training that goes to the communities around the stress testing, but also we've also seen like kind of the introduction of technologies and tools like drones that can support with this, particularly with buildings, but the challenge is in kind of complex environments, and I think Professor Liz here may be able to speak to some of that as well. I was just curious to hear from you, are you seeing some innovations in this area of stress testing that allows us to better manage these kind of situations to get on the ground and provide the insights, and if you help to share a bit of your experience on that. Thanks, over. Thank you.
Thank you very
Absolutely.
much. That question was for both Ben and Liz. So if there are no further questions, I'll pass the floor to you. Maybe Liz first, and then to Ben.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks, Abhilash, and thanks to the speaker for the in the audience for the question. So I think that there are lots of opportunities to collect information about local challenges to resilience, and then obviously depending on the information available and the need of that community, we can use a variety of different tools. The stress testing is a very important and a key tool for understanding the resilience of infrastructure on the ground. And I think that will be a primary tool for taking this forward. But there are other computational tools, but also soft systems tools where we can analyze a system qualitatively to understand the challenges to resilience. The Sendai multi-hazard framework, of course, the SDGs also speak to this, not just SDG 9 for infrastructure, but also SDG 17 for collaboration, because collaboration is going to be one of our key opportunities for making sure that recovery and building back better or building back differently will be done much more effectively. So I would recommend a range of methods to get the best understanding and to get the best outcome.
Thank you, Liz. Ben, any complementing suggestions here?
Absolutely. Yeah, quick follow-up. So it's when we make sense of resilience, the way that we have written about resilience is that it is a function of space and time. We often focus on the time component, or the ability to prepare for, absorb, recover from, and adapt to adverse events. Equally important, though, is that space component. And when we characterize a system's resilience, what we're really talking about is how one or more domains of a piece of one or more domains of a complex system, in this case, complex infrastructure, are affected by an adverse stimulus. These domains for infrastructure could be the material assets of the piece of physical infrastructure, like the material composition of a roadway for a major highway. But equally, there are other domains like finance, like the environment, and of course, like society. What we saw at the outbreak of the COVID pandemic is how important that social domain is. Of course, we need to be tracking environmental hazard, human health risk, infrastructure maintenance, and financial systems. But all of this, what glues much of it together, and where there are considerable interaction effects across systems, is how individuals and communities absorb information and then respond to a stimulus. Often, unfortunately, from the perspective of fear, for when you see an existential risk like a major pandemic arise. So, in terms of how we can best monitor that from a stress testing perspective, while social media and other tools like that are still reaching much of the world, the growing availability of them and our ability to conduct sentiment analysis can give us early clues to when the mood or perception of risk or attitudinal behavior of individuals or components of our society, including the most vulnerable and disenfranchised in our society, are understanding the surroundings about them, how they're changing their behavior, and how that is likely to reinforce itself in a positive or negative feedback loop moving forward. So again, it's very elementary, sentiment analysis and machine learning and AI of social media. But it is something that, when plugged into a stress test, does give us early clues to how infrastructure systems may be more or less disrupted in the presence of one or more hazards.
Thank you, Ben, for that. We are a bit above the allocated time, but and this has been very enriching hearing both of you here, Ajay and Vijay, but also all the panel members who could join us virtually. And a special thanks to Liz and Sean and Ranjit and Ben. I guess, Ben, you are in your early hours in the twilight zone of, I don't know, where 4 a.m. or something, or 3 in the morning. So very grateful for that. And I also don't want to do the conclusion here, because I don't think I can justify or be fair enough for everything that you all mentioned, everything that was enriching. But before we close the session, I want to give a last 1 minute opportunity to everybody, each of my panel members. You'll have 60 seconds, let's say, and if there was one key message that you would like to pass on for the audience who is both present in person here and those who are virtually, on the issue of infrastructure recovery and building resilience to that process, what would that be? Ajay, you want to go first?
I can give it a go in 60 seconds. What's the primary key message I would like to do? As I mentioned, there are two aspects. One is regulatory measures. We can strengthen some of those, but the collaboration is the big thing that we need to look at. We need to pull together research, government partners, stakeholders, communities, bring all of them together in terms of really understand what is it that we want our resilience measure to look like, what's the investment going to cost, and it goes across the board to government, the infrastructure providers, as well as community. They all bear the cost. So we need to really have a joined up approach and coordinated and collaborative approach to really understand the aspects of the infrastructure resilience that are critical to us, and how do we build resilience to ensure the impacts on communities are reduced post-disaster.
Thank you, Ajay. That was very helpful. Ranjit, please.
Hello. This is very interesting, informative discussions. So this discussion may be helpful for as we are working toward the recovery process current situation, so that the information that we get here and discussion will be very, very useful. I'll be definitely put forward to the government and for the necessary, because we are right now almost everyday discussion about how we should go for the recovery process very quickly. We are talking about the short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures for the present crisis. Therefore, this discussion and all the everything will be really helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ranjit. Sean, your 60 seconds, please.
I would get behind what initiatives are out there already. So the work that you guys have done around the principles for resilient investment, I think, is an excellent piece of work. I think get behind the projects like the ones that we're doing together on the 7 mechanisms for resiliency, the sustainable development goals stuff that we're doing for the industry. But most importantly, I think I would get behind the fact that we are starting to work together and that we all need to work together, because we can't solve this problem in groups. The silos have to go, and we have to start talking to each other much better. And we have to start looking at what the real impact is, because I think the time for talk is finished and it's now the time for action. And we need to get on with it because we haven't got much time.
Thank you, Sean. Vijay, I'll end with you.
Listening to all of you, I would actually say continue to listen to the communities most at risk, convene an all society approach which brings the academic knowledge, the private sector resources and government resources together, and put the accountable and transparent financing in the right place. And last but not the least, do it. So we have had enough discussion on this. Now it is time that we operationalize this.
Indeed, act now. So thank you very much again for taking out time and joining this discussion. This was very enriching. Special thanks to all my colleagues who are on the line and also everybody who was joining virtually. If you want to go back to bed, some of you, please do so. If you cannot, so we apologize for that. But before we close, I would invite all the audience here in the room for a round of applause for our panelists, and both here and also joining us online. Thank you.